So, resuming the recording, we were talking about the school day and the end of the school day and what might happen at the end of it. So, Robin, do you want to tell us perhaps the routine when you got home, having walked back from school, anything that you might do at home or the routine generally, you know?
Well, we used to play in the street with the kids and things
Yeah.
like that, you know. We played marbles. We had old bicycle wheels with no spokes in, rims and a stick. And used to go and play games of those in the street. Later on, when we were a little bit older, we used to make the trolleys out of old prams and pushchairs and race down Hawcliffe Road in them,
Yes.
all that sort of thing, yeah. In the summertime, we'd be up the tips, going picking blackberries in the evening, you know, when it was nice and warm. In the winter time, we used to go around one another's houses, swapping comics and doing things like that, you know.
What sort of comics did you have then?
Well, I can remember the Beano and the Dandy and that sort of thing. I remember the Eagle comic coming out as well. It was in the very early 50s, I think. And that's what we did. We always passed the time away. We always plenty of things going on.
Going back to you said about the trolley, is that like what I would call a soapbox cart?
Yep. Absolutely, yes. Stuart Attenborough and myself had the fastest one in Hawcliffe Road. Beat every other trolley racing down the hill. Brilliant.
So how did you, just as a practicality, when you go down Hawcliffe Road and at the end of it is the A6,
yeah.
how did you stop?
Well, we used to do a U at the bottom, U-turn at the bottom.
Did you?
Outside, well, what was Peabody's house then. We used to have a cycle and radio shop there. And we used to do a U-turn there, skid round and... But there wasn't a lot of traffic on the road as such. I mean, if you did go across, you know, there was... You were lucky really.
You didn't normally get...
Yeah.
Going back to you said about the summertime going up the quarry, what sort of... I don't know whether this was what you would do at the end of school or was it during the summer holidays, weekends, whatever?
All the time in the summertime, we were up the tips there. We used to build dens and made all sorts of things. Yeah, we had a lovely childhood, really. We were never worried about anything there, anything untoward happening towards us, you know.
And the quarry didn't stop you from going in there?
No, because all this part here above Hawcliffe Road was sort of abandoned, and obviously at the top of Hawcliffe Road was what we called the sky tip, which was.
Do you want to tell us what the sky tip was?
Well, the sky tip was a huge pointed tip, in actual fact, where they used to tip all the waste, and it had powered by an electric motor and winches, and it hauled the wagons up to the top. The doors opened, all the waste dropped, and if the wind was blowing in the right direction, straight down Hawcliffe Road, Monday morning washing, and Mother was quite irate, so were all the other ladies, all the dust blowing onto the washing. And it was just released right at the top of the hill. It must have been about 200 foot high, the sky tip was. It was quite a big project when you looked at it, and you could see it from miles around because of its bright colour. It stood out, it really stood out in the landscape.
Bright colour being white, do you mean? Or?
Whitish, a sort of very light brown. Really stood out in the countryside. You could see it miles away. And I think the aeroplanes used to spot it as they journeyed in and out, sort of thing, you know.
And you said about the aeroplanes, just picking up on the aeroplanes using that. Are we talking about wartime aeroplanes or
wartime aeroplanes? I suppose later on in the war as well, because it was obviously you could see it. If you could spot that, you knew exactly where you were, sort of thing, you know.
You said before about like an air raid where the planes were coming over. I mean, was there a lot of planes flying over this area during the war?
Well, there must have been, because at Ratcliffe was the Air Transport Auxiliary Base, where they used to fly all the planes in for delivery out to all the fighter squadrons, bomber squadrons, etc., all over the place. And since I had a look at the Ratcliffe history, and I'm quite interested in it now, sort of looking at what happened at Ratcliffe in those days. And there must have been lots and lots of planes coming over, because one of the later jobs they got after about 1941 was to ferry all the Spitfires out from Castle Bromwich, take them to Ratcliffe, and then used to fly from Ratcliffe all over the country to the various squadrons who wanted Spitfires. And so there must have been lots of planes coming in, but we never really noticed them as such.
So were they taken from, going back to the practicalities of Castle Bromwich, that's where they were made, is that
That's
right?
where they were made, in a big aircraft factory there.
And then they were brought by a train or something?
No, they were flown by pilots, the Air Transport Auxiliary, yeah.
Oh, right.
A lot of girls.
Oh,
and lots of American girls at Ratcliffe doing it as well, yeah.
So they were then, that was like a central distribution?
One of the one of the air transport auxiliary airfields, because they're all over the country. Various airfields allocated to various manufacturers of aeroplanes to fly all these planes about. Yes.
Wow.
Yeah.
And you said about the Americans there, like American...
Paratroopers there were.
Paratroopers,
Paratroopers,
right.
yeah.
You want to tell us anything about that?
Yeah, they were stationed in Wood Lane in Quorn. There was all these tents, the name of them, bell tents I think they were called, round tents like.
Yeah.
And they were stationed in these tents, and they did all their training in the quarry in Wood Lane. Mum actually did laundry for the Americans. They used to bring laundry up in a truck, and Mum used to wash it and send it. They used to come and collect it and send it back clean for the paratroopers.
Really? When you said training in the quarry, I mean, I'm thinking paratroopers, surely they would have been sort of like jumping out of aircraft, but obviously they weren't.
Well, there were firearms, shooting their weapons, mortars, bazookas,
Right.
all sorts of things like that.
Yeah.
Yes.
And that was like obviously convenient for them because it was just up the road from
It was just up the road there, yeah. We always used to go into the quarry on certain days when they weren't there and look around to see what we could find that the Americans left lying about. Or
Really?
all sorts of ordnance. Most of it was dummy ordnance. But we did find lots and lots of stuff and bullet cases. And we used to go then to the erected some sand butts again the wall of the quarry, and we used to go to the sand butts and dig the bullets out that were in the sand and put them back in the bullet cases, and you had a cartridge belt full of these. It was great stuff. Yeah, but there's sadness in the fact that in so doing all this stuff they left lying about, unfortunately some of it was live, and sad to say that one of the boys in Oakcliffe Road picked a hand grenade up. We all had all this stuff lying about and brought it home. As we did. We brought all this stuff at home. We used to go and play games with it.
Yeah.
And in 1944, on Boxing Day, 1944, he was outside his house playing with this hand grenade, and unfortunately it went off, and he died. And that was, I think it would happen to, if I do remember right, my memory serves me correct, I was on the outside toilet in the afternoon, heard this bang, this huge explosion, and a few seconds later everybody started screaming and yelling. I do remember that quite vividly, the screams, and awful, absolutely awful. And apparently Pat Wellborn tells me the splinters are still where the brickwork was pockmarked on the house. They're still visible.
The original house is still there?
The original house is still there, yeah.
Because he was a neighbour of yours?
Pat lived next door to Cecil Stevenson, the lad was, who died. Pat lived next door to him.
So when you say about the pockmarks, you're talking about Pat's house?
No, one next door, Cecil's house.
In
yeah.
Cecil's house?
In Cecil's house, yeah.
Right. But the house is still standing.
And all the houses are still standing there.
So that was, I mean, that was, let's hope, the only sort of awful accident that would arise from that sort of thing.
Yes, it was an accident, obviously, but we didn't know the difference between live ammunition or, deactivated ammunition or anything like that. Oh, look what I found,
Yeah.
Just find smoke bombs and these, bazookas, what they used to have, these bazooka things. Yeah. But a lot of them were practice ones, like, you know what I mean? And, they used all that area for practice.
Was the quarry not functioning at all?
No, that quarry wasn't functioning at all, no. And that's the one that all the mills are in now for operating the big quarry in Bun Wood. And all the mills, a lot of stow mills sit in that quarry now.
Mills being the
crushers,
yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Going back to the quarry itself, and I mean like this area too, you've got the river, you've got the quarry. Somebody I know mentioned before about the tip as well.
The tips, yeah.
Because that was sort of like part and parcel of your life.
Yeah, it was. Yeah, the tips. In the summer, we used to go down swimming in the rivers, swimming or paddling, paddling most of it, I think, with kids. And the rivers were beautifully clean then, because you could go to where we used to go, Barrow Shallows we called it, which is across the bottom of Betty Ends's Lane there, and you could see your feet in the bottom of the river.
Sure.
To show how clear it was. Everybody went there in the summertime doing silly things like that.
Yeah.
Because you could walk right across the river there if you were, got about up to here and you're okay, yeah.
And the quarry, I mean, obviously it gave you an opportunity for scrambling and clambering and climbing and such like
All
that,
the on all the tips, yeah, they did, yeah. Oh, it's great. And of course, there used to be a lot more tips there than what there is now. A lot of them have been taken away.
Right.
There used to be what was called the Seven Sisters, just off Bond Lane, and these huge tips. And there were seven of them.
Mm-hmm.
And at the top of one of them, there used to be a home guard post.
Really?
Yeah.
To keep an eye out.
To keep an eye out, yeah.
You told me earlier about Pat and some occasion when Pat saved your life. You said
he did save my life. Yes, he did. I do owe him my life. Yeah, I really do. So some of the strange things you do as boys, because the Hawcliffe Hill Quarry, where it actually happened, was on 2 levels.
Yes.
And it was in a very, very cold period. The previous day we'd been up there on the upper level, rolling boulders down onto the ice to see if we could smash the ice up.
Yeah.
And the ice was fairly thick because some of these boulders bounced off it. And that was the deepest point in the quarry, that particular corner. We had a great time rolling these boulders over and watching it. And we did eventually smash the ice and, great. During the night it snowed. And Pat and I went up there one day and, look, it snowed all over. Let's have a walk across the quarry.
Across the ice?
Across the snow, on the ice. And I wonder where we were smashing the ice up, you see.
Yeah.
Treading very carefully, and I found it. And I went down, straight down, in the water. And as I went down, I put my arm up, and Pat reached down and grabbed hold of my arm and pulled me out. And bearing in mind I'd got Wellingtons on, and I'd got some overalls, we used to have to wear at school for metalwork. And I got these heavy overalls on, and if I'd have been there a few seconds longer, I would have just gone down. I cried when I had to go home, because if I told my dad, he'd have killed me. He really would have killed me. And I invented a story. We'd been down Betty Hens's lane, skating on a little pond down there, and the ice broke, and I just went on my back and fell in. That explained the wet clothes. Yes, and I got away with that one, but I was very, very lucky, and I'm ever grateful to Pat for doing what he did.
Did you ever tell your parents what had actually happened?
Never did.
And how old were you at that time?
I must have been about 12 or 13.
Okay.
Pat was perhaps a bit older than me. Pat was about 14, I think. Yeah, very, very lucky indeed. Gosh. Very lucky. So stupid when you think about it.
Yeah.
Looking for where we'd broken the ice on a sheet of snow,
Yeah.
Oh dear.
Discovery, isn't it?
And what? Yes.
Going back to the sort of wartime years, when the war finished, you were about 8.
Yes, right. Yeah.
Did you actually sort of venture into the quarry and all that sort of thing at that age, or was it a bit later?
No, we were in the quarries at that age.
Were you?
Yeah, yes, definitely, yeah.
So even after when you started school, it wasn't unusual for you to
open up the tips, yeah. Little boys, 5, 6 years old.
Really?
Yes, absolutely.
With older ones?
Yes, older ones, yeah.
Sure.
Noel Wakelin, he was one of the older boys, and
right.
his brother David, and
yeah.
all sorts of Pat, and Brian Bonshew lived next door to Pat as well, Tony Crawley, and all sorts of names spring to mind. Owen Greasley was another one, yeah.
Those people in your life then remained in your life through to leaving school?
To finishing school, yes, and
right.
And onwards when we were teenagers, young teenagers. Yeah.
Unless there's anything more from either from the wartime years or your childhood, whatever, that you want to tell me about, Robin. I mean, I'm thinking in terms of moving on to work. Is there anything that we haven't mentioned so far about your childhood?
I don't think so. It's fairly generally covered, I think.
Yeah.
Yes, I think, yeah.
Things. Yeah. Is there anything that sort of you always hold as a treasured memory of those years?
Just one memory, because Dad was away fighting in Italy. He was in Italy at the time, and of course I hadn't seen him for an awful long while. And one day, Mum and I were walking up Hawcliffe Road. We were about halfway up Hawcliffe Road. And I was obviously looking round and looking behind. I saw this man walk round the corner in an army uniform at the bottom of Hawcliffe Road. And I said, Mum, there's a soldier coming. There's a soldier. Is it Dad? And Mum, I said, no, that's not your dad. And I said, are you sure? I said, I think it is. And I ran all the way down Hawcliffe Road, and it was my dad. He'd come home on leave. I can't remember what year it was, whether it was during the war or after the war, but I know he'd spent most of the war in Italy, because I got his war record now. It was probably after the war, and he came home and we were so pleased to see him. And I do remember he's got his full kit on, all the webbing, and he got ammunition pouches on the front, and they were full of Rowntree's fruit gums. I always remember that, Rowntree's. Of course, there weren't a lot of sweets about in those days,
no.
and he'd bought these Rowntree's fruit gums, and yeah, I was a lovely memory that was. Yeah, 'cause we did miss him. We didn't, because he wasn't there for at least 3 years of absence.
Yes.
At least 3 years of absence, because he went in 1942, early 1942, and he came back. That must have been the end of the war, I think, when he came back. And then it wasn't demobbed until a year later, 1946. He was actually demobbed.
Was it? What work did he go into?
He was in the Royal Engineers, a sapper in the Royal Engineers.
Oh, that was in the army.
In the army, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And what sort of was he an engineer by trade then?
Not engineer, but he was a handyman, shall we say. Okay. One of the jobs he was doing when he went into the army was working at the Frigidaire factory, and they were making these self-sealing petrol tanks for aircraft. That's what they were making. And he was working on those, and he'd done all sorts of mechanical jobs before that, and before the war, anything you could get your hands on, because before the war apparently work was very, very scarce.
Yeah.
You did any job you could get hold of,
yeah.
labouring, digging out trenches
Sure.
or whatever,
Sure.
to get the money.
Yeah. Okay, so if we move forward then to when you left school, what age were you?
I was 16 when I left school.
Right.
I was at the junior college school studying for GCSE, or GCEs I think they were called then.
Yes.
O-levels, yeah. And I was in the last year. And Dad, bless him, he'd been on at me for months. He'd, yeah, right, you're going to school, you'll be out there earning a wage. And it came to a head at Christmas, says, you're going to leave school. You're not going to school anymore. You can go to work, find a job. And I left it at Christmas in 1953, I think it was. 1953 probably, Christmas 53.
Yeah.
I think June had worked at the Brush then as the secretary. And
your older sister?
My older sister, and she knew somebody in the personnel department, obviously, and I had to go for an interview to be an apprentice. And I passed the interview. But because the Brush then trained apprentices in their own apprentice centre for a year before they went out into the workshops, I had to wait 6 months because it was mid-term, like in the apprentice year.
So what did you do?
So they sent me down into the offices, switchgear offices, and I became an office boy. And obviously got to know the Brush because he used to go everywhere taking bits of paper and messages and stuff like that. And yeah, I did that for 6 months, and then went to the apprentice centre and trained there for a year. I was over 17 when I came out of there, and I went into the turbine shop, where we made steam turbines, and that's a marvellous apprenticeship that was, absolutely marvellous. The skill level was very, very high indeed, obviously in turbines. He started off doing the lowest of low jobs, cleaning castings and fettling castings and water testing pipes and stuff like that, all the sort of horrible jobs that nobody else wanted and the apprentices always got, and then you graduated up into your skill level. The ultimate thing was to get onto blade work, and the turbine blades, that was the highest skill level as such.
Just take you back a moment. You used a word there which I don't know what it means. Fettling, I think you said.
Fettling, yeah. On the castings, there were obviously flashes and things on the castings. You knock them off with a chisel and grind them off to make them smooth and things like that.
So these are the bits that are sort of like sticking out after the from the main.
From all the sub-assemblies that went into the turbine, oil pumps and stuff like that.
Okay.
So everything was made at the Brush.
Okay.
The complete package. We used to make the condensers for the turbines and everything, all in the one shop.
Steam turbines would be used in
power stations. And at that time, there were power stations were Doncaster, Northampton, Brighton, all where Brush turbines were. You remember the towns where the turbines were in, these power stations.
Right.
And that's what we did a lot of the work
and
for.
The power stations being stations to generate electricity.
Electricity for that area, sort of thing. That's before the grid came in force a bit later on, I think. But
right.
All the borough councils in that area had their own power stations as such.
Right. You did your apprenticeship, where, as you say, you got the various jobs that nobody else got.
As apprentices, yeah, we always did, yeah.
The actual site at Brush, you mentioned about going hither and thither as an office boy in the time before you started as apprentice. I know of the Brush just beside Loughborough railway station now. Is that the same site, or is it bigger or different?
If you're on Loughborough station and you look across, there's one shop with still got the big Brush sign on, I believe. That's the Turbine shop, and that's where I did my apprenticeship. To the right-hand side of that was all the buildings for where these transformers used to be, and right to the other end of the bridge, Meadow Lane, is it Meadow Lane? I think it's called. The road over the meadows, and yes, Meadow Lane it's called. That was the end there. That was all switchgear. It was a huge site in those days.
Right.
Huge site. There were 5,000 people working there at one time.
And just going back again then to you said you moved sort of like in terms of the type of work. It became more and more sophisticated or more demanding.
Yes. Oh yeah.
Tell us the nature of the work that you were actually doing there. You said about moving on to blades eventually.
There were certain skill levels you attained going through the things, building small sub-assemblies, and then eventually you went on to the erection gang, where the turbines were actually erected inside the shop and tested. If you got on the erection side, and you had to line the turbines up then, because the Lungstrom turbines as they were, they didn't use just one shaft with blades on. They had two rotors and two sets of blades, both revolving inside one another in a very small package. Total package of blades between them was about 3 foot wide on the bigger turbines. And that was all the blades that were in there. So every bit of steam impinged on one blade, passed on to the blade opposite, so that made the turbines turn in opposite directions, yeah.
So, in terms of them eventually producing electricity and so forth, how did that work?
Because they've got two rotors either side running each set of blades, and our turbines are rated in megawatts, and the biggest one we ever did was 50 megawatt. Nowadays the big turbines are sort of 500 megawatt.
Oh, right.
But the beauty about the Brush turbines was, with such a small blade area, when you put steam through it, the blades warmed up very quickly because in such a small confined space.
Yes.
And therefore in 10 minutes they could be on full load. With the axial flow turbines that all the other people making, like BTH and English Electric and places like that, they were using axial flow turbines where all the blades were on one long enormous shaft. And to warm that shaft up took a day and a half or 2 days before you could run it up to full speed.
Wow.
That was one of the beauties of the Brush turbines. If you wanted a quick burst of power, it could be unloaded within sort of 10 minutes on full load, pushing out 30, 40, 50 megawatts.
And was it only steam turbines that the Brush made?
No, later on, in my last 2 years, we made gas turbines as well.
So before the break there, we were just talking about gas turbines, and that was a development for Brush, Robin. So do you want to tell us about the gas turbines then?
Yeah, we'd obviously been designing these gas turbines some time with other people in the Brush group at that time, because the Brush group was an amalgamation of diesel engine manufacturers, all sorts of people throughout the country, entitled made up the Brush group. And these gas turbines, as they were, the gas itself was made by something called a gasifier, which was made by a company called the National Oil and Gas Engine Company, and they provided the gas to run the turbines with. And we built 6 of these small turbines, axial flow gas turbines, for Kellogg's. I think the factory was in Liverpool. I don't know the reasoning behind it, but they wanted 2 identical sets. One as a backup for the other one, and there were 3 sizes of turbines in this, so there was two of each, and we made them in the works at Loughborough, made everything in the works at Loughborough, and by that time I was very well regarded, shall we say, in the turbine shop, and they put me, at the end of the day, they put me in charge of dispatching these turbines, so I had to be responsible for making sure everything on the turbine was correct. It was all sealed, packaged, all the parts were there with it, any assemblies had to be done and made up, I had to do them, and I did that, and that was something for which you got merit money for. I think I got 7 or 6 a week for something like that.
Extra,
yes. And
This was in what because you said you started the brush in 1953, so
53, 54, yeah, this was getting on for 59.
Okay.
58, 59 now, this was, yeah.
And you got 7 and 6 extra.
7 to 6 extra for doing that work.
What was your regular wage in those days, if you don't mind me asking?
Can't remember, but it must have been about £9-10 a week, I guess.
Right.
Because when I came out of the army, I do know quite vividly I was being paid £14 a week by the brush, because we had to apply for a mortgage, and I know that's what we put down on the mortgage. Always remember that, put down the mortgage form, weekly wage £14, and I think the real mortgage repayment was £12 a month, so we just qualified apparently. So it must have been about £9 or £10 a week, and then we always worked overtime as well, and also I got some more merit money for doing blade work, because each ring of blades, there must have been about 15 or 20 rings of blades on each set, so there was like 30 sets of blades, all had to be oversped in the overspeed chamber to make sure all the blades stayed in place.
Okay. And when you say oversped, you mean sort of going faster than
normal running speed, yeah.
Right.
We used to run them up to about, on the smaller sets, up to about 3,800, something like that, revs a minute, and the running speed of the turbine was about 3,000 maximum power. And if you had to put the set of blades into this rig, make sure they're securely fixed, then assemble the rig into the overspeed chamber, seal it all up, and you stayed there while they ran the electric motor up to that drove the thing, because you had to make a vacuum in as well, put it in it's a vacuum sealed chamber, and get the vacuum going and do all that, and you stood that. And for that you got another 7 or 6 a week once you did that. So
15 shillings then.
Yeah, it was, yeah. And then if you lined a turbine up, that was I never did fully line a turbine up by myself, but if you did line a turbine up, you got another 7 and 6 a week.
7 and 6 was obviously the magic figure.
The magic figure, yeah. 7 to 6 increments, yeah.
Right.
So if you got all three sort of thing, you're in highly regarded, yeah. I never did fully line a complete lungstrom up, but obviously helped.
Sure.
Helped others do it, and yeah, it was quite an intricate job. A lot of people used to worry about it, because just imagine if anything was slightly misaligned and these things were rolling round at 3,000 revs a minute, it would make quite a noise and be a lot of damage occur.
Dangerous, isn't it?
As happened in actual fact, we were refurbishing some blades for Brighton Power Station, and now Brighton Power Station was a 50 megawatt site, and they were big blades. They were. These blades had been refurbished and they were put in the overspeed chamber for testing. Now this was a slower running set. These ran at 1,500 revs a minute, so the overspeed for those would have been about 2,000 maximum. And the motor that drove the overspeed bit was in the rotor shop, which was next door to the turbine shop. Right. And the responsibility for putting the gears into the gearbox that drove the overspeed chamber was the rotor shop's responsibility.
Right.
Nothing to do with the turbine shop. And once we'd put the blades in the pit, sealed it up, it was over to them to make sure the right gears were in. And apparently, for some disastrous moment in time, somebody didn't bother to check what gears were in the gearbox. And the tachometer was on the motor, the electric motor that was driving the gearbox, not on the gearbox itself. So when the started to run the motor up, it started to complain somewhat at round about 2,000 odd revs. And at about, I think it was about 2,300 revs, something like that, these blades actually exploded inside the overspeed chamber because they were going far too fast.
That was the end of that.
And that was the end of that. And it actually made quite a mess there, because all a huge concrete block surrounding the overspeed chamber, and it cracked the concrete, the actual force of the impact.
Dear.
Yeah, and it actually wrecked this set of blades, yeah. And that was just because somebody had forgotten to check what gears were in the gearbox, because obviously one set of gears was for 3,000 revs a minute, and another set of gears for 1,500 revs a minute.
Really?
The motor speed was about 2,000 odd, and it was over 2,000 odd, and the blades let go, and that was it.
Right.
And that was a sad old day, that was.
I bet it was. After the story of the unfortunate accident to the turbine that you had there, And that was a gas turbine?
No, that was a steam turbine. That was steam turbine for
Okay.
Brighton, yeah.
Okay. Do you want to tell us, just taking us back a little bit in terms of the process of producing the turbines themselves? How were they made up?
The turbine itself was made up of where the blades were housed in a huge cast iron cylinder, which was in two halves, bolted together.
Where were the castings made then?
The castings, can't remember the casting firm that made them, but we had a stock of castings that were kept out in what we called the castings yard. And if they had castings out there, they used to sit them down on the ground for about a year. We used to call it pickling, letting the cast iron harden and settle properly, etc., etc., before it was taken into the machine shop to start machining it up.
See, I mean, as a non-engineer and a non-turbine person, thinking of leaving a piece of metal outside in the rain and the air,
that was it.
Sounds like a bad idea.
Absolutely, yeah, absolutely.
But it's not.
But it's not. No, it's good for the casting. Good for cast iron, apparently.
Right.
And of course, these things weighed anything from sort of 5, 10, 15, 20 tons.
And so the outer casing was two of these
two halves bolted together.
Right.
With
Who bolted them together?
We obviously bolted together, yeah.
Right.
And on each end of that was a stator. A stator is the outside windings of an electrical motor. Two what we called end casings on the end of that. So it's quite a long turbine.
Yeah.
In actual fact, in regards to that. But the actual blade space, as I say, was only about 3 foot maximum.
Did you make those blades?
The blades were made, yeah, in the blade room, yeah, the blade room, yes, and they used to come in, and we used to assemble them into the turbine and that.
So your job was actually taking those blades already made and actually assemble the
blades into the turbine. That's like the la creme de la creme of the job.
Of course.
If you get what I mean. Anything to do with blades, you were on. Yeah.
And the blades themselves were made. How were they made? They didn't come in like the castings from somewhere.
No, they're only various lengths of blades up to a foot high for the low pressure steam as it came through all the other blades, and very small blades for the high pressure steam.
Sure.
As it escaped through each ring of blades going outwards, and then all the waste steam then was in a vacuum. The whole cylinder was in a vacuum, so all the steam was whipped down away into the condenser to be turned back into water again, to be fed back into the feed tank and recirculated by the boiler and as steam again. So,
right.
yeah.
Right. So the whole turbine itself was self-contained?
A sort of self-contained thing, yeah. If you've got a boiler house that could make steam, that's how it was, yeah.
Right. Now, in relation to the Brush as a organisation or a factory, there was another aspect to, apart from the turbines, there was other things that either took place there or you were involved in?
After I came out of the army, I went into the loco shop.
When did you go into the army?
In 1959.
That was conscription?
That was national service.
Yeah.
I was 21 in October 1958. Yeah. And at that time, they were calling you up within 14 days of being 21. We'd already been to Leicester for the medical, for the army medical. Can't remember where it was, it was somewhere in Leicester anyway, and I must have passed.
Yeah.
But I didn't hear anything. You know, a month went by, 2 months went by, and it got to Easter, and I thought, they missed me. And at that time I was courting my wife, and my wife was somewhat younger than me. She was 17 and a half, I think, at that Easter time, and I was, of course, 21. I said, well, we've been going out for a long while now. I want to marry you, and shall we get engaged? Yeah. So we got engaged that Easter.
Okay.
Carried on, and I said, you know, when we're going to get married, and I think her mum thought, and Dad thought, well, probably a bit too young, let's wait a bit longer, that sort of thing. And then all of a sudden, in May time, this dreaded brown envelope came through the door. You will report to Catterick Barracks with a railway warrant inside. And of course, I was off into the jolly old army, shall we say. So that was wedding plans put on hold for some time.
Really? Yeah. 1959, did you say?
In 59, that was, yeah. May 1959,
right.
Yeah. Yeah, so
you went into did national service for, is that
2 years? 2 years, yeah.
Right.
Came out and
you went back into the Brush.
I went back to the Brush to work, I'd been out of the army 2 weeks, and we'd put a deposit on a Jelson house which was being built on Kirkson Drive in Loughborough.
Okay.
And that was going to be our home. We got married in the following October, and by that time I was working back again, and obviously the turbine shop had closed down by that time, so there's no turbine shop to go to. They'd moved it out for some strange, obscure reason, and I went into the what was called the traction motor shop. Yes, I went in there and we were building the traction motors for the Type 2 locomotives, one of the first big locomotives that British Rail had ordered, and I think the Brush had got an order for about 200 of them. So that was quite a big order in those days, and we made, I think it was 4 motors to each locomotive and a generator as well, to a DC generator coupled to the diesel engine to provide the power to the motors. And we got this order for say 200, and it was repetitive work. Don't get me wrong, because once you'd assemble one traction motor, you could assemble 1,000 of them in exactly the same manner.
Yes.
But in those days, it was very strictly controlled. You know, the British Rail had their own inspectors in the workshop themselves, making sure that everything was right to their specification, shall we say.
Yeah.
We went on doing that for some years, in actual fact, and then we put an order in British Rail put an order in for 500 of the Type 4 locomotives, which was the bigger locomotive for general duties, freight and passenger. And with 500 locomotives, that made 3,000 motors to assemble and 500 generators, and that was an awful lot of work. And at our peak of production, we were turning out from our shop 5 sets of locomotive, 5 sets of equipment for 5 locos, that is. That's 30 motors and 5 generators every week. Every week. Day in, day out.
So it was like 24-hour shifts and so on?
Yes, it was night shifts on, yeah. And that was... that lasted for about a year, that peak did, because the Brush were assembling 3 locomotives a week in the loco assembly shop, which was the old turbine shop, been made into a loco assembly shop, and they were sending 2 sets to Derby workshops at Derby. And the British Rail were assembling 2 locomotives there themselves. That's when I started going to do some outside work, because the British Rail locomotives weren't as well built as ours, and we'd supplied these Type 2 locomotives as well, and the maintenance standards were quite poor really on some of the BR stuff. One of the jobs we had to go around changing all the brushes on the generator, all the brush gear on the generators, because there wasn't enough pressure on the brushes, and they were sparking too much. So we had to go around and change all these brushes. I can't remember how many brush boxes are on. There must have been a dozen or more on these generators, and there were obviously a lot of carbon dust there. They were very dirty and filthy.
Yeah.
And we started at Derby workshops, and then we used to go to other workshops in the country. Myself and another chap